Here's what's coming up on episode 58 of the Big Séance podcast. Morgan Dix.
We did tons and tons of spiritual practice. Our whole life revolved around spiritual practice. And I remember meeting a lot of other people who kind of came to that path, as it were, through things like lucid dreaming, or through kind of that more almost supernatural exploration. How do I just calm myself down? How do I calm my mind is just always like plugged into a light socket, and I cannot unplug it. It's just like zhoosh, 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 it's like going round and round. Your higher self is involved in the very moment and motive and impulse that compels you to meditate. So the part of you that wants to meditate, the urge, that itself right away, you could say, is already your higher self. One of the biggest questions we get is, how do I make meditation into a daily habit? And people really struggle with that. They start, stop. You may lose focus. You may be counting, 5, 6. Where are my groceries? I'm gonna go for a workout later. I'm like, that girl was so hot. And and then boom. Oh wait, the count.
Welcome to the Big Séance Podcast. I'm Patrick Keller of BigSeance.com, and this is a place for an open discussion on all things paranormal, but specifically topics like ghosts and hauntings, paranormal research, spirit communication, psychics and mediums, and life after death. So basically, anything that pops up in my paranormal world. The candles are already lit, so you might as well come on in and join the séance.
Hey, come on in, paranerds. Light those candles and get that tea or coffee ready, because today we're jumping into the topic of meditation for the first time. And after my long week, I'm thinking, kind of like a massage, I just might need some meditation. That's probably not how you're supposed to practice meditation, but maybe we'll find out. But first, I know I usually do listener feedback at the end, but today I want to start with it. I just want to say that in the last few weeks, I've had a lot of listener responses regarding both my interview with Guy Lyon Playfair, the man who wrote the book after experiencing what we know as the Enfield poltergeist, the story featured in the upcoming Conjuring 2 movie, though there's a little more to that, so if you haven't listened, you'll want to check that one out. And then just last week, in a bonus episode, I released the audio version of our live Ouija session with Karen A. Dahlman, which seemed to get just as much discussion, really, as the live video on YouTube did. If you haven't seen that video, I'll link it once again in the show notes for this episode. Carrie reached out to me, and we had a nice conversation about the Belvoir Winery, the Missouri State Penitentiary, and she told me she's thinking about adopting a grave this year, which I think is super cool. And I want to hear back from you if you do, okay, Carrie? I heard from Jen, who has invited me to check out the history of historic St. Genevieve, Missouri. And I have to say, I think she's convinced me to make that trip happen. It's not far from here, and I don't believe I've ever been. I heard from Paul Prospery, who has always been supportive of this show. He's the one referred to actually as PC in the live Ouija session with Karen. So he's got an interesting book in the works, apparently. I also heard from Jenny, who is going to send me a book I had to check out. And I heard from Jacqueline. So thanks for reaching out. We've had quite a few new additions to the Big Séance Parlor on Facebook, where the chatter has really picked up, and where we've started a cool Ouija cup club. Do you have a cool Ouija cup? I wanted to give some quick shout outs to Maduri, Chris, and Jana on Twitter, and to Heather from the very popular Craftlit podcast that dates all the way back to 2006. Through Twitter, I found out that she's been listening to the podcast, and she had some kind things to say. Thank you, Heather. I received 2 more very thoughtful 5-star reviews on iTunes recently. Cheesy Dork, who calls the show a must-listen, left a glowing review in Canada's iTunes store. Shout out to Canada. And K Papo says, my little show is an awesome podcast, in a very kind review left in the U.S. iTunes store. Well, many of you have been patiently waiting for the next audio issue of Tim Prasil's Spectral edition, and so in just a little bit, your wait will be over, so stay tuned. My guest today is Morgan Dix, a veteran meditator. Morgan is a co-founder of aboutmeditation.com. He received 15 years of formal meditation training in a contemporary yoga and meditation ashram, where he also created online courses and learning opportunities for thousands of people. After meditating consistently for 20 years, he started sharing his passion for meditation through About Meditation. He creates online courses, writes articles, and currently hosts the popular OneMind Meditation Podcast, interviewing meditation teachers, researchers, and everyday practitioners. Morgan was recently a guest teacher at a mind-body medicine workshop for students at Harvard Medical School, and frequently writes about meditation for BeliefNet, Elephant Journal, Do You Yoga, and Performance Lifestyle. Welcome, Morgan. How's it going?
Great, Patrick. It's great to be here.
I am so excited about this. Our first jaunt into nerdiness and meditation on the podcast.
Awesome.
Haven't had it before. You and I have both been interviewed on Harry Duran's podcast Junkies. Yes. And you were the episode right before mine. So I'm listening to this really awesome interview between you and Harry, and I'm thinking, duh, I haven't had an episode on meditation yet.
Yeah.
And I know with this, genre that I'm talking about every week, surely there are people that either have meditation problems or enjoy meditation. And I'm like, it's really about time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome.
And so if it's okay with you, I'd like to kind of point people in the direction of that Podcast Junkies interview with Harry Duran, and I'll put the link in the show notes. That interview is good stuff, and shout out to Harry, by the way.
Yeah.
And maybe we can kind of consider that a part 1 and move on to some really, nerdy meditation stuff, how it kind of applies to us. Is that cool? What do you think?
That sounds great, Patrick.
This is very much a podcast on paranormal topics, and we actually talked about that a little bit a few minutes ago. But I've always lumped some topics that I would consider to be, quote, spiritual into the category as well. Not quite a decade ago, my life changed in many ways. It's when the paranormal came into my life, but it was also when I began experiencing what I've coined my spiritual shift, which I'm still in, I think. Mm-hmm. And I guess early on, I began reading about things like channeling and astral projection, which were really deep to start with. But so when I began investigating the paranormal, blogging, and now podcasting about the paranormal, that and spiritual topics were all kind of wrapped up into one package from me. Coming from your end, do you see the same relationship between the two that I see, or is this strange to you?
Well, it's interesting to me, for sure. And as we mentioned a little bit before the show, I think I see them on a spectrum. Like, because for me, I guess, so I spent about 15 years in an ashram, like a yoga and meditation community. We did tons and tons of spiritual practice. Our whole life revolved around spiritual practice. And I remember meeting a lot of other people who kind of came to that path, as it were, through things like lucid dreaming, or through the kind of that more almost supernatural exploration in their lives, things that happened to them that they didn't have sufficient explanation for. They didn't have the vocabulary for. They didn't have reference points in their life to say, hey, what the hell was that? And, sometimes I think you get some of these, particularly from the East, some of these kind of gurus who were able to, this was very much part of their milieu, like crossing over into different planes of consciousness. They were able to communicate with other beings. And of course, a lot of the spiritual life has to do with ultimately a reckoning with death and what that represents. And obviously for all of us, our relationship to that sort of absolute point, because we're all going to die, at least at this point, and unless technology really kind of changes things completely and extends our lives, it's a point that we all have to deal with, whether that means ignoring it, suppressing it, or embracing it, or kind of harnessing it to kind of drive us. I would say, that point, how we relate to that point often says a lot about our lives. It's just something you can't avoid. No human being can avoid it, right? And so I think death is such like it's the 800-pound gorilla sitting in the room for all of us our entire lives. And some of us deal with that and some of us don't. Now, one way is you embrace the spiritual path, and all the spiritual paths kind of use it as a point of reckoning, right? Like, what has your life represented? There's like a moral accounting, which death sort of represents, I think, for a lot of us. Then there's also a lot of like the more paranormal, paranormal, and then the Tibetans talking about transition and how a lot of the Eastern traditions see life and death in a more cyclical or circular context, and they don't see death as an ending, just as a continuation of a cycle that continues forever, right? And obviously our Western context is very linear, and with scientific reductionism, often now people just feel like, well, that's it, lights out, we're extinguished, nothing happens after that. So there's all these different ways to look at it, and it's all kind of fits under like this rubric of the spiritual life. And then these gurus, I feel like they're some of the guys who seem to, men and women seem to kind of straddle these different worlds and these planes of consciousness, and they're able to talk about beings who don't live according to the same rules or the principles that define matter don't define their existence. They live on a different plane with different rules. And some of that, I think, includes what happens after we die. Do we transition or do we get stuck? Things like that. And so this is a very long-winded answer. I'm kind of throwing a lot out there.
That's
but
okay.
I think it's like basically when you ask that question, I'm like, wow, there's a lot to say about it. And so like how that then relates to ghosts and things like that seem to kind of pass into, through, or kind of come into our plane of being, that I guess to me it's all part of this mystery, right? And I guess for me I have not conclusions, but just a lot of questions about all of it. I feel like I'm not, at least that I know of, that often gets upset by reality. I don't think I have too many hard conclusions about it.
Well, maybe I shouldn't be surprised, but I was actually surprised that I think it's interesting that death was kind of the connection between these two separate, spiritual and paranormal. I think that's interesting.
Yeah.
And it probably shouldn't be a surprise.
Yeah.
That was the answer. Interesting.
Yeah. It got, I'll tell you, it got me going on. I think part of my own spiritual life started when I was like a little kid, and I tried to imagine what it would like to not be. And I just like really remember that time as a little boy in my just bedroom, lying down and trying to imagine non-existence. Like,
wow,
how could I not be? And I think that's a very natural thing for a human being, but particularly a little person who's like struggling to deal with the reality of death. Like that, a little kid we're obviously less conditioned. We're less habituated at that point. So we will, I think we can go places in our awareness at that age and imagine things that it's harder to as we get older because we're just more habituated. And I do remember the experience of trying to imagine non-existence or non-being, just that no, I don't exist anymore. And what's that? Then what is there? And I remember my heart pounding, and my blood just moving quickly and feeling a kind of, I think a fear. But I think I approached something in that act. And I think it triggered a momentum, or it opened a portal in my own awareness for questions that I think would go on to shape my life and my direction. So I think death it's big, right?
Yeah. Well, and that's what's interesting is, I keep talking about a decade ago in my, spiritual shift, using quotes with my fingers.
Yeah.
And that was one of the coolest things that I got out of it from the very beginning. I kind of grew up in this Southern Baptist fear background, and I pulled away from that, but I didn't really have any of my own, I guess, solid beliefs or anything from running away from all of that. And all of a sudden, when I started, reading all these things, I wasn't afraid anymore. It was all of a sudden like, okay, it was a comfort in, knowing that there was more out there, so that it kind of freed me from freaking out about the death.
Was there like something in particular?
It was, well, I'll tell you, the book that I've always, and it's kind of dorky, but the book that I've always credited was James Van Prague's Ghosts Among Us. And then that book started like a whole line of different things, and meditation was one of those things that I tried. Like it was a struggle for me, and part of that is probably because I was lumping channeling and astral projection in with it, and that was way too early on in my journey to even be reading about that stuff. Yeah. But I think part of the problem is that I always want to know if I'm doing it right, or well, I'm kind of moving on to a different question accidentally. I'm sorry. Or what am I supposed to see? What am I supposed to allow myself to think or feel or hear? And am I just wasting time? And then, I'm sure, these are questions you get all the time, right?
Yeah, definitely.
What are some of those questions that you get? Like some of the main questions that your FAQs you get on meditation?
Well, they would be quite like definitely a lot of the ones you definitely hit on. So how do I know if I'm doing it right? The perennial one is, how do I quiet my mind? Also, what you said is people just don't know what should be happening in meditation. It's like, it's such a kind of hard thing to get your arms around, and especially if you don't have a guide or some guidance. And of course, there's different paths, there's different techniques, different approaches. So people are like, which one should I choose? Which is the right direction for me? How I'm so stressed. How do I just calm myself down? How do I calm my mind is just always like plugged into a light socket, and I cannot unplug it. It's just like zh, 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 it's like going round and round. And that's so the more I hear that, and with the endless news cycle that we're in, the kind of the way the world has shrunk with the internet and how we're all connected, and I think those things all make more sense. Like the nervous system of humanity is more connected, so we're all more stimulated. We're more hyper stimulated because there's so much more information in the system, and I don't think we have all the individual mind, and the global mind hasn't yet kind of caught up with, well, how do you take care of yourself in that context? How do you take care of your mind? So I think so those are questions, like, simple but important questions that people have.
I guess I could probably relate it to, I think about my students. I'm a middle school music teacher. And a lot of times in music, I have to keep reminding them, especially when it comes to the creativity, that there's no right or wrong answer. And they always want to know, well, is this right? And I'm like, I don't know. Do you feel like it's right? I guess it's probably similar to that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there are some right ways to do it, there's some, but because we're in our minds, it's like, did you ever hear that talk by David Foster Wallace? Something, it was like his graduation speech at Kenyon. And it's like,
it doesn't jump out at me. I'm not sure.
Well, he's just like, he starts it out by saying, there's two fish swimming along, and they're just swimming along, and then and they're kind of happy and talking to each other, and another big fish swims by, and he's like, "Hey guys, how's the water?" And then they look at each other, and they're like, "The water?" And it's like, it's this principle of sort of like, when you're so deep in something, like we are in our minds, you don't even know you're in it. And meditation is like, it's so much about stepping out of the momentum of your mind. And for most of us, that is just, it's not really, because we're so conceptual. Our worlds are fundamentally mediated through our minds. The idea that you could step outside of, stroke objectify your own mind and the movement of your own mind, that there's a part of you that you can identify with, that is not your mind, that stands apart from your mind, that's still, that is fundamentally unmoving versus the mind, which is always moving. That's until you experience that, you can't conceive it, because it's not a concept. And because we live mostly through our minds, which is fundamentally a conceptual apparatus, you can't get at meditation through your mind like you can get at, our world. Everything around us is the product of our minds. So that's part of it. And like, that's why the fish thing is like a good metaphor.
You interviewed Harry Duran as well.
Yes.
And he said something toward the end, like, I'm communicating with the future version of myself or something like that. What is actually happening when we meditate? And are we communicating with our higher self? Is it automatically our higher self, or is that just kind of what happens with some people?
So that's like a many-layered question. And
I'm just here to challenge you. That's what I'm here for.
I'm glad. It's like, so there's a couple ways to come at this, and I'll do my best to answer it, and it will be incomplete, but we can at least start to get like, we can kind of paint the walls of the room. So we're standing in a room and we know we're standing in a room type of thing, like, and not just out in space. So like, I would say, and this comes a lot from the way I was taught, but your higher self is involved in the very like moment and motive and impulse that compels you to meditate. So the part of you that wants to meditate, the urge, that itself right away, you could say, is already your higher self. It's a part of you that is seeking clarity. It's a part of you that's seeking insight. It's a part of you, that is yearning for meaning. And so right away, from the first moment, that higher part of you is this is what I would argue is involved. And so and then so everything downstream of that is variations on that theme. Every ounce of effort you make, every deliberate modicum of effort that you put into your practice is your higher self. Every insight, every recognition, every moment that you bring yourself back from mind wandering is your higher self. It's both the action and the motive all in one thing. You're never really apart from it. So it is fundamentally integral to the whole event of meditation. That's one of the beautiful things, is that it's a process of nurturing a part of yourself you don't usually get to nurture. And everything you do, every deliberate effort you make in your practice is nurturing and building, supporting, growing that part of yourself. And so like then what is meditation? There's like two ways, fundamental ways to approach meditation. One is meditation with seed, or meditation with like an anchor. One is meditation without seed, and which is meditation without an anchor. So meditation with an anchor is like, I'm going to meditate on my breath. So I'm going to sit down, I'm going to relax, and I'm just going to count. I'm going to count each breath, just a natural breath. I'm not like breathing deeply or any particular way, but I'm going to keep my attention on the breath, and I'm going to count each breath to 10, and then I'm going to start over again. And as I do that, I'm sitting perfectly still. I'm not moving at all. So I'm making the effort to be perfectly still. And I'm making the effort to keep my attention on that anchor, which is the counting of the breath. So say that I do that for 30 minutes. My attention will start to wander off of that count from 100 to 500 times to 1,000 times in that session. And that is absolutely not the problem. And it's part of the practice. The essence of meditation is really the action of bringing your attention, once it starts to wander, back to the anchor. So you may lose focus. You may be counting, 5, 6. Where are my groceries? I'm going to go for a workout later. I'm like, that girl was so hot. And like, and then boom. Oh wait, the count. And like, so, but that's just, the mind is like a dream. In meditation, you just see that the mind flows like a dream from one image and concept. It's just a network that it just flows through all these different things. Or, if there's something you're upset about, or you're angry about, or you're concerned, usually what meditation is wonderful at reflecting to us is our deepest fears and desires. So that's what the Buddha famously identified as the core of human suffering, fear and desire, right? Because it's the desire is the moving towards, and the fear is the moving away. And what happens in meditation is that action in us of always moving towards things and away from things. And things in this context means like objects in our awareness, Like, so that fantasy, that always and is constantly reflected to us because we're trying to keep our attention on this anchor. And then, but you see there's something pulling your attention away from that anchor continuously, and then you're bringing it back. And then your mind goes out, and then you're bringing it back. And so every time you're bringing it back, that is the muscle of attention. It's like
I was just gonna say muscle.
It's exactly what it is. It's like the Zen. I think they call it like taming the ox. But the fitness metaphor for our age would be that's the rep. That is the rep. That's the squat. And attention is unruly, and we don't. All of us. We learn how to train our minds, but we don't really in school learn how to train our attention, as it were. And meditation is really at its essence training your attention. And so you kind of see these layers. There's the simple action of counting your breath and bringing your attention back. But then and then so that's your commitment. When you sit down to practice, everything you're doing is just that. You're only doing that. It's just one thing. So that's it. You're also at the same time, you're making complete and total effort to be still. You're also making the effort to do that without any tension. Meditation, as my former teacher used to describe, it's the perfect middle place between alertness and relaxation. It's that perfect point between where you're not so relaxed that you become groggy or sleepy, but it's not a hyper alertness. It's just a perfect state of relaxed awakeness. And so you're in that position and you're just doing this action again and again. But then at the same time, in what something comes into relief when you're doing that, and what comes into the relief is the movement of your mind, that movement away. And you start over time, the more proficient you become at this, you see, oh, my mind moves in patterns. Like, and so, for example, is this good so far? Like, it's a long answer.
Yeah, no, totally digging it. Yeah.
All right, cool. Like, so, for example, I was on, and this really comes clear when you like go on retreats. That's like, so you'll go like 10 days in silence. Like, you really get to see your mind on like a showcase when you go on retreat, because all distraction falls away and you're just doing your practice. So like, I remember one retreat where like, this was like a real kind of breakthrough retreat for me, where it was like, I was giving absolutely everything to my practice, and it was a beautiful retreat. But like it was because this action that we're talking about, I was really making tremendous effort. And what started to become clear to me is that there were three things that I would have they would be the things that would capture my attention the most. These would be the most distracting elements. It was the fact that I wanted a new car, I wanted a new computer, and I was separated from my wife, and I wanted my wife back. So it was like the girl, the computer, and the car. The girl, computer, and the car. So in the beginning of the retreat, they were all very like detailed things. I was thinking about the Dell laptop and, the lines and the curvature of the, it was like the thing I wanted. And same with the car, it was like the car was just like, oh, the car, but the more I practiced those things, it's almost like they pulled away. They just slowly became less and less distinct and more like objects, until finally they became just like any other thought, and they didn't have the same stickiness, and they didn't have the same almost density. They didn't have that gravitational pull on my awareness. And it was because every time I would get caught in it, I was letting go. And every time I get caught, I'd let go, until finally that momentum of letting go, it just became more powerful than the previous momentum in me, which was to go towards, because I desired these things so much. I had developed a very strong inner habit of like dwelling on these things. And that's what you get to see, is that in a way that you can't usually in just mundane daily life. You don't always get to see where your mind is really, the eddies, where your mind hangs out. And so once those two things just became sort of objects, and then they just basically melted into the mind stream. And then all my thoughts just became a very singular stream of thoughts. There was nothing that was distinct anymore. And that kind of lets you, it's very freeing on some deep existential level. When that happens, there's a release. You're like out of a semi hypnotic state, and you start to see that. You're like, oh God, yeah. Usually I'm hypnotized by my fears and desires, and it's incredibly subtle. You don't really get to see these dynamics until you really do more meditation. But this is a lot of what meditation is about. It reveals layers of self, layers of these patterns of attention and awareness, and how awareness works, the kind of mechanics. But but almost more importantly, the fact that you can always step out of the momentum of your mind. And meditation is the practice of doing that. It's the practice of kind of aligning yourself with, ultimately, you just discover, just through this letting go again and again, you just discover a part of yourself that is untouched by all of that. It's wholly and completely just imperturbable. It never is, it's just a different dimension. It's not affected by your worldly life. It's just a core center. It's just life. It's life independent of events and drama. It's just the kind of vital essence,
So there's definitely benefits like for mental health, I guess. So to me,
yes,
listening to you is like someone would choose to go to therapy. It's just kind of a different way of doing that.
It can be. It can, and like anything, it's a tool. It can also be used in other ways to obscure. Like, it can feel really good. And if you can sometimes feel amazing in meditation, but it like anything can be an escape as much as a place of illumination. And I've had both.
You're listening to the Big Séance Podcast with Patrick Keller. Look for us on iTunes and be sure to check out bigseance.com for more discussion.
We're going to take a quick break from all this meditation nerdiness so you guys can get all Spectral up in here. So as promised, here's Tim Prasil.
Thank you, Patrick. Welcome to Spectral Edition, in which I read actual ghost reports published in U.S. newspapers between the years of 1865 and 1918. In a number of the articles that I've come across, it's very clear that the reporters are having some fun with the ghost report. Whether they're based on actual reports, I don't know. Sometimes it'll be a newspaper making fun of a different newspaper that published a ghost report. But today I've got two of this kind of ghost report. The writers are having a bit of fun, very, very clearly. The first one came from November 25th, 1873. It's from the Alpena Weekly Argus from Alpena, Michigan. And the title is A Ghost in Alpena. The neighborhood in the vicinity of the blacksmith shop of the late E.H. Vail has lately been thrown into convulsions by the reported appearance of a ghost in the old blacksmith shop. As the story goes, one man saw it about 11 o'clock one night. Now, if that man had been at home with his family in proper season, he would probably have no reason for seeing ghosts. Another man, after playing 37 games of pool and drank at the end of every game, started for home, and when passing that blacksmith shop saw 3 ghosts dressed in all the colors of the rainbow, or the ghost saw him, he couldn't tell which. Another man who told his wife he was going out for a few minutes and did not return until nearly midnight, on passing the aforesaid shop, saw a ghost about the size of a large elephant, dressed in white, standing in front of the building. Now, he was a courageous man, and he walked up to Mr. Ghost and dealt him a heavy blow with his fist. He now discovered that he had struck the whitewashed door of the shop, and he went home, holding his hand, which ached with pain. The next day, the doctor set the 3 broken fingers. Last Saturday, 2 young men went to look for the ghost and found that the shop had been cleared of about all the machinery and was a suitable habitation for ghosts. But his ghost ship failed to put in an appearance, so after concluding that they had been on a tomfool errand, left the scene without being able to see that ghost. The next article was published in August 22nd of 1874 in the New Northwest, which is a newspaper published in Deer Lodge, Montana. It has no title, it just reads as follows. A Wisconsin paper mentions as a remarkable circumstance that a certain man out there, quote, has positively seen a ghost riding a yellow horse along a turnpike and flourishing a wagon stake, close quote. This does seem to me to be a little out of the common run of things, but it is not as marvelous as it might be. How very much more extraordinary it would have been if that man in Wisconsin had seen a yellow wagon stake riding along the turnpike on a ghost and flourishing a horse. And even more odd it would have been if he had seen the turnpike riding a horse along a yellow ghost and flourishing a wagon stake. While I should have been painfully surprised if he had seen a horse riding a wagon stake along a yellow ghost and flourishing a turnpike, or a yellow turnpike riding a ghost along a stake and flourishing a horse and wagon, or a flourish staking a wagon along a horse and riding a ghost of a turnpike, but any of these, I think, would have been sufficiently sensational to have amazed even that fool in Wisconsin. You've been listening to Spectral Edition. I'm Tim Prasil, and I have more than 200 of these articles. I post another one each Wednesday on my new website, The Merry Ghost Hunter, MERRY Ghost Hunter. I hope you stop by.
Thanks for joining us for the Big Séance Podcast. We'd better get back to the table while there's still some candlelight left.
I heard you mention that it took you years to meditate without falling asleep.
Yeah.
Is that true? Tell my listeners about that, because I can imagine that would be a common thing for people.
Yeah. It took me 8 years. All right. So if before we were talking about meditation with an anchor,
mm-hmm.
the tradition I trained in was more something called free awareness. So it's meditation without any anchor. So the idea and the practice is that you're supposed to just our meditation instructions were just this. They were be still, relax, and let everything be. So those are very, relatively vague instructions compared to count your breath, which is very, very specific and very concrete. You have an anchor. There's another, and those are considered more preliminary practices. And any path you go on, you're going to get preliminary practices where you have a mantra or you have an object to focus on. And it's really excellent training. And then some paths which are called more something like immediate awakening or something like that. But this is the path that our teacher taught, which was just, you just kind of get thrown into the deeper water. And the idea is instead of putting your attention on something, you're putting your attention on nothing. So the goal is to really just let everything in your awareness just pass through and not fix on anything at all. And so what's challenging about that, it's very hard to know when you're lost. Whereas with meditation with an anchor, which is called focused awareness meditation, you can always come back to your anchor, which is your breath or your mantra or whatever. So most of us in this school of practice really struggled, and it's just overwhelming to try and sit there and do nothing and focus on nothing. And it just took me an incredibly long time to find traction in that practice. So what would happen, and it happened to a lot of us, but I was definitely one of the, at least while I struggled, probably one of the worst. I would just fall asleep relentlessly, because that, it's almost like you're just up against the sheer totality of existence and you're trying to not do anything. And it's almost like a survival response. You just, boom, go to sleep. I almost fell off my pillow once, sitting completely cross-legged, upright, and then boom, just gone. And that's how it would happen. You just start to nod off and nod off and nod off. And part of that, I think it's just when you're starting meditation, there's all sorts of reasons you might be nodding off and falling asleep. But for me, I think that was a big part of it. It was just, the task was too great. And it just took a long time for me to find my own groove with it. And when I did, suddenly the whole thing lit up. And I was like, oh my God, I get it. Or I got something. And from then on, I didn't fall asleep. But
that muscle figured it out.
Totally. Exactly. There was I found it happened when I was struggling with something, and I was really just going over it. I was sitting in meditation and I was going over and over and over it. And then I just stopped and I asked myself, I was like, what does this have to do with meditation? And as soon as I did that, it was like the thing that I had been ruminating on and kind of chewing on, it just sort of released from my awareness. It resolved itself into almost like a single point out in front of me, and then it dissolved. And it was like my whole body felt like a feather. And I fell into this deep, beautiful state of meditation. And really from that point on, meditation was easy for me. It was very natural. And I learned a lot from that, just asking that question, but it somehow activated a part of me, some part of my own questioning was the key to all of it, to finding my own ground in the practice. And I think that's important for everyone who wants to meditate, is you don't want to just take everything on faith. It's really important that you have questions. You're going to have questions. And those questions are very specific to you. And they're really important. And it doesn't always, you don't have to know why. But they are. For me, I found that the questions are the heart of everything. You got to follow your own questions. And you don't settle for answers. I mean, you want to take the answers and consider them against, the backdrop of your own experience. But that's what I found out. I was like, my questions are the most important part of this whole process.
What are some of the cool ways that we may be meditating and we don't even know we're doing it?
Well, like music, like you were saying, I think there's ways in which entrainment happens with rhythmic, particularly rhythmic music, that there's something very deep in humanity. I think of it because we are from the cradle of civilization, and there's just the percussion, right? That this used to be a very because we come from tribal origins, and the tribal context would bring the tribe together, often around whether it's storytelling but often it was rhythmic, kind of percussive events. They could transport people into different states of awareness. And I think that music can often transport people into different, deeper states of awareness. And they just may not have any idea. But in the process, there is I think a kind of a small transformation that happens every time that happens. So I think Music is a good one. I think often like running would be another example. Like running and sometimes rhythmic exercise can also put you into a very meditative state. And you just may not have any idea, but I know for years before I actively meditated, I think the way I dealt with a lot of things, it was like running. And I think running would put me in these meditative frames of awareness. And I didn't really know it, but I think exercise is another big one.
Do you have an episode on binaural beats, or am I imagining that?
Yeah, and that's a great example. It's called, let me look, but yeah, I have a great interview with John Dupuy, who's the founder of iAwake Technologies, and I really recommend that interview because he's an incredibly soulful guy, and yeah, his story is pretty amazing. And he got into binaural meditation. He'd been a long time meditator, but had lost his brother had committed suicide in his living room. And like the same week, he lost his dog got run over. He lost his job. He found out his girlfriend was cheating on him with his best friend. It was like the week to end all weeks. And he really became almost like suicidal himself, but eventually found binaural meditation technology, and it gave him access to a part of himself that nothing else had at that point, and totally pulled him out of that whole situation, changed his life. Yeah, so it's episode 43, How Mindfulness Heals and Opens the Heart. Oh no, sorry, it's episode 39, Can Brainwave Entrainment Meditation Accelerate Your Growth?
Well, I'm sure the other one's good too.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, man.
So I want to, we'll talk about the podcast and your website, definitely. But before then, I'm going to steal one of your questions that I've heard you ask. Who inspires you?
Well, I think for me right now, it's like, so I listen to a lot, probably like you, I listen to a lot of podcasts. And I think, all right, so 2 books I just read that rocked my world were Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me. And that is a book about a kind of different American narrative. And, he writes for The Atlantic. He wrote a landmark article called The Case for Reparations. And he's an African-American writer who writes about, he grew up in West Baltimore, and he just writes about the American experience from an African-American perspective. And it's the farthest thing from strident, but it just crushes you in I think the best way. It broke my heart and opened my mind in a lot of new ways. And I found that to be a really remarkable piece of literature. And so that, and then Junot Diaz wrote this book, The Brief and Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde. And he writes about, it's a life of a fictitious family over a couple generations from the Dominican Republic. And it's more or less about this dictator named Trujillo. And just the writing is so unbelievable and just kind of layered with vignettes from history. And the history part of it's nonfiction, but he uses a fictional family to kind of tell the story, and it's just brilliant. So I feel like for me, reading these stories and then a lot of the podcasts and podcasters that I'm listening to who are kind of changing or evolving the form of story, that inspires the hell out of me. I just believe in storytelling so deeply, and I think it's always for me been a vehicle for development and healing and just moving forward. And so I think all the podcasters out there.
Yeah, it's definitely a big part of my life in the last several years.
Yeah, you must feel similarly.
Oh yeah, like I have close to 50 podcasts that I keep up with somewhat regularly. And of course, there could also be some addiction problems there too, trying to keep up with podcasts. But there's quite a bit of inspiration there too.
Yeah, man. Why do you think for you, what is it like that besides the addiction part, which I can get to?
The inspiration part?
Yeah.
Well, for me, it used to be definitely books and reading. And unfortunately, the creative process of podcasting has kind of cut down on that. So it's, I don't know if it's like an outlet that I kind of have moved that same energy toward or what, but I, read a book now like every 2 months as opposed to one a week. Yeah. Like I used to do. Oftentimes it's my students, sometimes little surprising things my students will do, little middle school nerds.
Yeah.
But a lot of podcasts, and I listen to a lot of nerdy podcasts.
Nice.
That would surprise people.
Do you like sci-fi?
You know what? You would think that a paranormal person would really get into sci-fi. I don't. My eyes kind of cross and my brain gets confused and it doesn't translate.
Got it. What about fantasy?
No. Yeah, well, and it's like fiction in general, especially with reading. Yeah. I feel like I'm wasting my time.
Yeah. A lot of people feel that. It's interesting. I love fiction. I just love it. But I hear you. I think a lot of people feel that way.
So which came first? Was it aboutmeditation.com or was it the OneMind Meditation Podcast?
About meditation. Yeah.
And tell us where, I guess we can kind of move this into, tell us what's coming up and where people can find you and what they'll find if they check out the podcast. I can tell people right now that one of the coolest ones, and it's not just because it was the most recent, but I just loved, as of this recording, your last podcast episode was guided meditation for deep sleep.
Nice.
And it was interesting. It was very cool. And so they can check that out, but go that direction. Tell us all about that stuff.
All right. Well, thank you for that. And I'm glad you liked it because for me, I just follow impulses with these things. So I was like, we should do one on sleep because a lot of people struggle with this. So I'm glad, half the time I'm just making this stuff up as I go, which every podcaster knows. But I'm really glad you like that. So About Meditation has really been a labor of love, and my partner Tom Burchard and I started working together about 2.5 years ago, and the idea was really to build an audience first, and then move into monetizing it, turning it into a business. So we're kind of starting to pivot in that direction. The podcast is still, going strong, but we now have like 6 contributing authors on board that we're going to start publishing starting sometime this month. So we're going to increase, whereas I've been pretty much the sole content creator on the site, we're going to now really have an infusion of voices, new voices on, and really going to be promoting our multi-author blog, and each author having kind of a focus, one on meditation in the brain. She's a scientist and a neuropsychologist, and then a yoga teacher is going to be doing one on kind of yin yang yoga and meditation, and then another one who is an acupuncturist, and he has a healing arts center. So all of these new voices coming to the site, which is we're really excited about. We're launching a new design later this month in March, and we're kind of redesigning our whole membership offering, and so the site's it's about to take a big leap into a new I don't know what you call it, a kind of new stage of growth. And I think, we're going to continue to develop more courses and products for our audience. So I'm super psyched about it. My favorite part of the whole thing is podcasting because I feel like it's so intimate and I like connecting with people this way.
Absolutely. Where would be like the one place that you would send someone who is just starting, like on their journey to meditation or early on in that journey?
Well, I would like to say one of our episodes in the podcast, episode 8, is like how to turn meditation into a keystone habit. And that kind of distills a bunch of lessons I learned around the science of building habits and how that relates to creating a daily meditation habit, which kind of goes back to one of your early questions. I would say, and I don't think I mentioned this before, but one of the biggest questions we get is, how do I make meditation into a daily habit? And people really struggle with that. You know, they start, stop. And this episode 8 of the podcast, it really kind of gives you a really simple blueprint for doing that, and also talks about some of the science why it works. And so I recommend that's a great place to start. Episode 8 of the OneMind podcast.
Well, Morgan Dix, you rock. Thank you for talking to us today.
Thank you, Patrick. You rock too, man. And I really appreciate chatting and being a guest here. It's a real privilege. Thank you.
For show notes, including links to anything we may have mentioned in this episode, visit bigseance.com, now the home of both the blog and the podcast. Just click on the Big Seance Podcast logo or find it in the menu. You can also find and subscribe to the show on iTunes and Stitcher. Do you have any comments or feedback? Please contact me at patrick@bigseance.com. You can call my feedback line at 7755-TELL-ME. That's 775-583-5563. You can also record audio feedback right from the site using the SpeakPipe link included in the show notes. I could decide to include your voice in a future show. Thank you so much for listening and reading. Unfortunately, it's time to blow the candles out, but we'll see you and light them again next time.